Now, late Deputy International Relations Minister Ebrahim Ismail Ebrahim has been described as a gentle giant. The anti-apartheid activist died, you'll remember, in December 2021. Now, the icon is being remembered in a book titled Beyond Fear, Reflections of a Freedom Fighter. And we're joined by Shannon Ebrahim, his wife, to talk through the book. Thank you very much for gracing us with your presence this morning in studio. Maybe talk us through the writing process, because as I was reading it, it takes you on a fear. There's a lot of passion, there's pain, there's joy, and it's brutally honest. But in all of that, you could also get a sense of his tone, his gentle nature, and that is very present within the book. Talk us through that, how the process was, and also how important it was to make sure that the reader gets a sense of the tone of the late Deputy Minister.
I think for Ebrahim, he's wanted for the last 20 years to write his own story. I'm a writer, but he did not want me to write his book. He wanted it in his own voice. He's worked on it over the last 20 years, and I think he had gotten about 80% of the way when he found out he had lung cancer. And the general tone of the book is one of a triumph of the human spirit, of trying to explain to the younger generation exactly what he went through, the trauma, the danger, and the deprivation, but to also have come out of that with a positive attitude towards what our country has to look forward to, and a belief that South Africa has a tremendous future. And I think that positivity comes through in the book, in between all the trauma and the danger that he faced throughout his life.
Before we get into some of the details of the book, how was he able to do that? How was he able to deal with all of the trauma that he describes in various anecdotes in the book, but also then come out looking at the silver lining, and all the good things that are presiding within the country?
I think that's what surprised many of even his comrades, is that he didn't have any bitterness. He lacked rancor. He was absolutely committed to South Africa, to the economic liberation of the country, and he always saw that South Africa has been in much more difficult places than it is right now, and I think he just was committed to making sure that South Africa worked. And he's got 2 young children of 13 and 15, and he wanted them to see all the things that South Africa and our people are capable of. So throughout the book is this positive trend despite all of what he went through, and I think it will be shocking for young people to read just how much these revolutionaries actually endured in their lifetime.
No, absolutely. You make reference to young people quite a bit now, and I just want to get a sense for you, apart from this notion that we always have to live with hope and that there's always good even with the bad, what message ultimately and to who was he trying to share?
I think he starts off the book with a letter to his young children, and I think that he wanted the younger generation, many of whom haven't been exposed to the most recent biographies of struggle stories, to understand in a very simple and riveting, enthralling way in which this book is written exactly what the struggle was all about. And his story encompassed every imaginable angle. So it was 20 years on Robben Island, 2 sentences, it was being in the camps in Angola, it was being in charge of the ANC's underground but based in Swaziland, it was going to the former Soviet Union, being at head office in Lusaka, and then of course being in the New Democracy as a deputy minister. He's been through it all, and I think he can speak about everything that the struggle meant to these comrades and why they were so committed and were prepared to really lay down their lives for liberation in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. How difficult was it for him to recall some of the painful moments of the apartheid years? Because anyone who'll read the book will see that it's very detailed. He goes into quite strong detail into some of his experiences, but surely that probably wasn't very easy.
I think he's been almost on a yearly basis. He was visiting Robben Island with various people who wanted to see firsthand what the prisoners had been through, and he had been so used to telling these stories. I think it was second nature in a way to put it all down in a book, and many people begged him from about 1999 to please write his memoirs. And I think it's sad that today he can't launch it himself and speak for himself about what he went through, but it's a triumph in a way that he managed to complete it before he passed away.
No, absolutely. So I'm not going to spoil it for our viewers because they're going to have to get a copy and read it. But I found he told some nice tales about Miss Phyllis Naidu. So obviously he didn't work in a silo. They worked together to bring about the liberation that we currently live in. But he describes her as one person. That's when he understood that he could have someone who could be a comrade and at the same time be a parental figure, a guiding figure. And I'm sure he had a number of those. He also speaks about Chief Lutuli. So maybe talk us through that, the influence that his comrades had around him, and really just how he drew on their strength to inform his own.
Well, you know, in 1963, when they were captured, they had been involved in the early years of sabotage with Ronnie Castro's and others. He was #1 in the sabotage trial, which is known as the Little Rivonia trial. Phyllis Naidu was it was really his political or his struggle mother. And when he was left in detention without...
He calls her Ma, hey?
Yes, he calls her Ma. And she came to detention when none of his family seemed to be aware of what had happened to him. And she finds him in a horrendous condition in a cell that's 3 by 3, and she tries to see what she could do to assist. But being a political detainee, it was very difficult in those times. But throughout his first 15 years on Robben Island, she writes to him regularly. And as you know, at first they were allowed only a limited number of letters, but I have piles of letters that Phyllis Naidu and others wrote to him throughout his first 15 years. And he was one of the very few prisoners who ended up being sentenced twice to Robben Island. The second time, the judge saying he hadn't learned his lesson the first time, and he was sentencing him through his trial of high treason to another 20 years. So in total, he would have been languishing for 35 years on Robben Island, and luckily he won his appeal in time to get out in 1991.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you've mentioned one incident of where he was in a terrible situation, a fearful, a dangerous one, but maybe just share with us one or two other anecdotes where he found himself in a space where he thought he may not get out of this alive.
I think one of the stories that has really gripped the South African imagination, because it was all over the newspapers and the news in around 1987, 88, when he had his treason trial, is when it came out that he had been kidnapped by apartheid intelligence agents in 1986. He was in charge of the ANC's underground movement, but based in Swaziland in the frontline states, and very few people, I think only Ronnie Castro's and Lindiwe Sisulu, knew where he lived. Every 6 months he had to move location to another house because they were being hunted by the likes of Eugene de Kock and the apartheid hit squads as being the most wanted really in the frontline states. So they came to his house in the middle of the night, and they had found out where he lived through informers probably, and they kidnapped him. And it became a very famous international case that is actually studied in law schools around the world. The fact that in his trial they said the court had no jurisdiction to try him because he had been kidnapped from a foreign country. But I remember him saying when he was handcuffed and gagged in the car with his abductors, they weren't sure exactly where to take him, but they were discussing taking him to Vlakplaas. And had he gone to Vlakplaas, which is, we know, the infamous torture camp where people were tortured for basically to death for months, he would have likely died from torture. Because the one thing about him is that he refused to ever betray a comrade. He said he would rather die than to ever had given up a name or a location of any of his comrades. And luckily for him, Neil Barnard, the head of apartheid intelligence, instructed them to take him to police headquarters in Pretoria, and subsequently was severely tortured at John Vorster Square, but at least he didn't disappear into a dark hole. So that represents one of the many times that his life was in grave danger throughout his life, and it must have taken immense resilience and courage to endure that type of horror.
No, absolutely. I mean, we've just gotten to the tip of this particular iceberg. There's so much to get into with this book, and I'm really looking forward to finishing off. And I think one of the things Mr. Ebrahim was able to do so well, because I'll be honest, I'm not a struggle book person, Shannon, but what he was able to do was to be so raw that you want to be reading the stories, you know, very honest, and the language and everything about it just makes you want to just turn the page, you know, just what happens in this story or that story. So thank you very much for your time this morning, and I really hope you all go out. You did indicate that it's out this week, I assume?
Yes.
Yes. So this week, go out and get yourself a copy, Beyond Fear, Reflections of a Freedom Fighter, and that is the story of a former Deputy Minister of International Relations, Ebrahim Ismail Ebrahim. Thank you very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.